Okay, then we're good. It's rolling.
Okie dokie, everyone. Um, Full disclosure, yeah. Okay, yeah. Um, if I just pass out, I was really sick yesterday. I'm not contagious. I'm just kind of struggling still today, a little tired. We scheduled this from 3 to 5. I doubt it'll take 2 hours or anything. Um, okay, so the way this is going to work is I'm going to talk for a bit, and I'm going to walk through sort of like justifications for labor-based assessment, and then Dr. Johnson's going to talk about best practices, and then we're going to have some different examples and things like that. How's everybody doing? Anything there? Yeah. Yeah. Are you all really excited to be here? Are you? Yeah. Okay, so usually at the beginning of this talk, what I do is I walk through. So, labor-based assessment is traditionally associated with the aims of anti-racism and anti-racism assessment. So here I'm going to try to distinguish what those two things are, how labor-based assessment supports anti-racism, and how it is different in some ways. So again, anti-racism, the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices and attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So when we're talking about anti-racism, we're talking about seeking out and dismantling systems that create inequities. And so we're going to talk about that in terms of assessment. So how this conversation gets linked to assessment sort of initially, it begins with the enrollment gap in higher education, which has really changed in recent years. So from the National Center for Educational Statistics, the racial enrollment gap has decreased and is expected to further decrease over the next decade. 25% increase in Black student enrollment, 45% increase in Hispanic student enrollment, and only a 4% increase in white student enrollment. But what you're seeing is that the graduation gap continues to remain the same or even widen, right? So we're doing a better job of being equitable in terms of letting people into college, but in terms of how far they progress, how well they do in terms of grades and things like that, we're still seeing enormous gaps. So this is a quote from SIUC, who is we draw a lot of our stuff from for labor-based assessment. So he says, if the dominant discourse in the academy is taught exclusively by white middle-class teachers, then isn't it possible that such conditions will affect the discourse valued in writing assessments, in writing programs, and writing journals? Is it possible that those who achieve such positions, such credentials, might have achieved them because they can use and favor dominant white middle-class discourse, that they embody the discourse the field comes to expect? I don't know what discourse I'm embodying right now exactly. But that's the basic idea, right? That standard American English and white middle-class discourse sort of gives students a selective advantage, particularly in comp English 101, English 102. So a few of the sort of key axioms in labor-based assessment and anti-racist assessment is one, be transparent. Sort of admit the harm that you could be doing unintentionally. That's sort of a first step toward thinking about what can you change about your own practices. I tell this a lot. I tell this story a lot, but one of the first times I tried labor-based assessment, a friend of mine got me to go back through and code demographic data for my grading back through my career. And I noticed patterns that were really, really troubling for me, right? Like things I didn't realize I was doing. But that's a really good way to think about this stuff. Reflect on your practice and see what patterns you notice. So again, a few key terms in assessment. Just going to kind of like explain sort of the key concepts in assessment. So one, validity is one of the key terms when we're trying to assess anything. Does the protocol or the measure that we have measure what it says it measures, right? So it's like if you stand on a weight scale and you stand on it and it says the sky is purple, right? That's not measuring what it says it's measuring. Or if you stand on the weight scale and it gives your cholesterol or something like that, right? Reliability, how consistent are its measurements? So again, a weight scale, if you're stepping on and off of it and the weight's changing radically, then you don't have a reliable measure. And we want to have all three of these in the sort of assessment protocol we have. And then 3, finally, fairness. Do those measurements change depending on who is being measured? And that's sort of the issue with assessment and language in general, right? If you guys have been in the program before, sometimes we've done grading calibration, things like that. There's all kinds of methods that writing instructors and program administrators have done to try to get that fairness key point down. So with labor-based assessment, we tend to add the fourth term, justice. Of all the 4 measurements, or by all of our measurements, our grading practices are biased and not fair, and we know it. Now we take steps to ensure that all students have access to the full range of grades in our courses, right? So we really want to look at in our own courses or the demographic data in general for the program and say, are certain students not being allowed to access certain grades in the course? And if so, then we need to make adjustments. So labor-based assessment. So again, this is a type of assessment that assigns grades based on measurements of labor, how many hours you put in the task, the amount of words or pages you produce, and so on, which may or may not include some standard of quality. That's sort of one thing to point out, right? A lot of people have sort of pushed back at this, thinking you sort of get rid of standards. You don't necessarily have to, right? You can still put in measurements of quality if you want in labor-based assessment. So here's some of the data, and this scales pretty well to where our program has been in recent years. So this is from ASAL's work on data collected at Fresno State between 2005 and 2014. So 2 large assessment trends he notes. Students of color generally and Black students specifically are placed in courses deemed remedial at higher rates than white students. If you guys are involved in the COLA sections this semester, you probably will note that that scales there. In 2014, 23.6% of white students were placed in remedial writing courses, while 48.7% of Black students were placed in remedial courses. Students of color generally and Black students specifically were given Fs in their writing courses at higher rates than white students. 7.2% of white students were given an F, 19.2% of Black students. If that sounds bad, like look at it again. Right? If you scale that out over 100, that's over twice as many African American students are getting Fs, like almost 3 times as many. So are you going to believe that those students are just that much worse at writing? Or are you going to think maybe there's something wrong with the assessment protocol and the way we're sort of laying this all out? We have some other kinds of stats here in previous years. About 85% of sort of like white students have been passing English 101. Only about 48% of Black students have been passing. And they're the only demographic for whom an A is not the most common grade. So we have some of these same issues here, and they're not the fault of any one person. It's just structural things that we're trying to address now. So again, this is a measurement of how well this assessment can work. So between 25 and 2019, ASAL redid the study. 7.6% of white students given DFWI grades, 9.1% of Black students given DFWI grades. So again, it doesn't harm the students who are already doing well, right? But it just incentivizes them to keep working. Now, a really exciting thing that we had, I just got this data a few days ago. Our student success rate at English 102 in the spring, 90%. We only had 10% of students fail English 102 this past spring. That's a huge jump. We're usually down to about 65%. So instructors are doing a great job. We actually saw the most students and we failed the fewest of any program at the institution. Now I expect those numbers to go down some this fall with some of the stuff we have going on, but we'll break down those demographics and see sort of who's passing, who's not, and what can we do about that. So in terms of anti-racist assessment, 3 things: identify places in your assessment practices that favor white students, take action in some material form that is accessible, and assess the results of that action. So those are the things we want to do if we're going to talk about labor-based assessment. It's maybe addressing some of the DFW data we have here. We have to come up with specific initiatives, targeted, and then sort of reassess the data year after year after year. But again, the main reason we're doing labor-based assessment isn't really anything to do with this. Hopefully it does address some of these things, right? But again, what's the key term or what's the key concept that we're actually trying to assess? We're not trying to get students to write perfectly or write to a particular standard or write perfectly fluid and grammatically correct English. We're just trying to get them to write a lot, right? So labor-based assessment pushes at the thing that we actually want to assess, and that's kind of the main reason behind it. Okay, so I'm going to mercifully bow out now and hand it over to the great David Johnson, who is going to talk about some best practices.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel.
Yes.
So again, I do want to address a set of kind of basic best practices, nuts and bolts of what goes into creating a labor-based system of grading in your class, right? Or at the very least, a labor-based grading contract, right? As we understand them, right, and this is by no means an idea that's kind of novel or just started fairly recently, right? Folks like Peter Elbow have been writing about grading contracts for quite some time now. But at its root, labor-based grading really just involves a basic set of social agreements, right, on how a final grade is determined, and that includes really all of the measures that we would ordinarily apply in, say, a traditional numeric system or competency-based system. Things like attendance, right? Timely and adequate completion of assignments. So that means, meeting basic expectations of features, right? Has a thesis, has this, has that, right? Uses adequate support. Meets the word count. That's a major one, right? Completion of process work and scaffolding. So everything that goes into the creation of a final draft, right? From first drafts through writing center visits, through revision, especially required revision. Accountability and self-evaluation is often part of a traditional labor-based grading system. So something along the lines of a time log, right? Which is not something that I use very often, but giving students the space to actually document how much time they've spent on a given task, on a given reading, even if you're not grading them based on the amount of work that they've admitted to putting in, you can at the very least factor in the completion of their time log, right, as something that can count toward their assessment in the class, right? A grading schema that is not numeric or traditionally letter-based is super important. So I was pretty fortunate when I first started teaching as a grad student in that we were effectively given a contract-based grading system. But our system involved a system of checks, check pluses, and check minuses. So there were no letter grades, but there was a clear and exact breakdown of how accumulating a certain number of checks versus check pluses or check minuses would then translate into a final grade, right? Because we are obligated in any kind of traditional university system to assign a letter grade at the end of the term. And so this was kind of our way of avoiding letter grades in as much as we could until the very end, right, when they translated to a final grade. Now, in most of the labor-based systems that you're going to find if you do a basic Google search, they include default grades, right? And the default grade is usually a B. And it kind of justifies a B versus a C simply because it looks better on a transcript, right? And a B in a comp class is by no means a bad grade, right? It's actually really solid work. It means you've accomplished everything that you need to satisfactorily in order to receive not just a passing grade, but a decent grade, right? And the terms of a grading contract traditionally are usually agreed upon and often negotiated and renegotiated with students. And admittedly, this is something that gives folks a little bit of pause, but we'll talk about that closer to the end of my, a lot of material. All right. So some common concerns, and I want to go this route just because people usually tend to kind of react with, well, what could go wrong here, right? So student anxiety. Most of our students have spent, the past 12 odd years of their education in a point acquisition system, right, or quality-based assessment. So they may have some hangups when you first talk to them about, effectively not having grades in the class during the term, right? They may express confusion over how evaluations then translate to final grades. And then, of course, from the instructor side, you have anxiety surrounding rigor, right, as well as learning. So instructors tend to ask, well, what about learning outcomes, right? And does labor-based grading actually measure them, right? That issue of validity that Dr. Daniel mentioned before. Then there's the issue of how do we determine labor? Then there's practicality, right? Because admittedly, this is not an easy thing to do, especially if you're first starting to use labor-based assessment practices. And then finally, the issue of quality. So from the student side of things, when you encounter student reservations over labor-based grading, right, one of the things that I like to stress is the philosophy behind it, right? And again, research shows, especially research from Illinois, shows that students are more likely to prioritize learning, right, when they don't have the pressure of a grade or of getting a good grade kind of looming over them, right? So if they have the sense that if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm guaranteed to be in this class, right? I may not have to put in 100%, but I can put in at least 85% and be guaranteed an 85, then they'll be more amenable to taking risks, right, in their learning. They'll be a little less concerned with writing what they think we want to hear, right? And so the push is for them to kind of cultivate an interest in learning over a final grade, which is again a move that they may not be accustomed to in their pre kind of post-secondary ed experience, right? And it's also about respecting their effort. So the fact of the matter is, we have students from all different backgrounds of access, right, in any first year composition course. So you have students who went to suburban, well-funded, high tax base school districts who didn't have low teacher turnover or who didn't have high teacher turnover rates, who could afford new textbooks every year, right? Students who come from backgrounds of pretty substantial privilege. And then you have students who come from very different kind of educational opportunities and experiences and levels of literacy sponsorship, right? From both at home and in school. And so what a labor-based system tries to do is it tries to even that out a little bit in the sense of respecting the work that students do put in, right? Regardless of how successfully they adhere to, say, the expectations of a dominant discourse or a prestige dialect like standard American English, right? And really, ultimately, it becomes more about supporting key habits of mind, which those of you who have read the, CWPA statement, right, will be familiar with what some of those habits of mind are that guarantee, or rather are indicators of success across college for students, right? Another thing that I like to do is I like to avoid kind of nebulous grading schemas. So I have a very kind of concrete set of do this, avoid however many absences, you know, meet word counts for however many papers, and you will be guaranteed this grade, right? And I try to really adhere to that very rigidly. I stress the importance, again, of the fact that a B is not a bad grade. Not in the least bit. It's a solid grade, and I'd be perfectly happy with a class of mostly Bs. Which again is something that may surprise your students on some level. And then again, giving them the agency to negotiate and renegotiate, right? If you have students who have reservations about this grading system on day one, you might give them a chance to actually write about it, right? Turn it into a free write. Ask them to share what their anxieties are and then talk through it as a class. And usually when students feel like their concerns are being acknowledged and heard, they'll be a little bit more willing to take the journey with you, at least in my experience. Now, from the instructor side of things, right, we have the issue of validity, again, of outcomes. The thing that you want to bear in mind, though, is our outcomes may or may not actually be measuring what we intend them to measure, right? Very often the way that we judge writing is highly subjective. It's informed by our lived experience, our perspectives, again, our backgrounds. gender, race, educational history, disability, so forth and so on. Certainly socioeconomics. And very often we do make identity-based judgments of our students, right? I know we've probably all heard of implicit bias on some level. In writing context, Bethany DeVilla talks about the concept of indexicality, which is when you try to basically associate an identity with an imagined writer based on patterns that you notice in their writing, right? Specific, what we might call markers of identity. And in her research and research from writing center specialists like Nancy Wilson, we've found that very often folks are kinder to writers who they perceive to be writers that are ELL or second language learners than they are to writers who they perceive to be users of African American language, right? And in large part, that has to do with kind of boundary related issues, right? A generally more sympathetic view toward international students, so forth and so on. But therein reveals a major kind of inequity when it comes to how we grade people's writing, right? We shouldn't be making identity-based assumptions and judgments and using that to then inform the grades that we give people. That's unconscionable. So some of the things that we really need to do is we need to reevaluate what it is that we're looking for as folks who are assessing student writing. Are we looking for our students to be able to parrot a kind of white racial habitus as, or a prestige dialect like Dr. Inoue would call it, or are we looking for perplexity as Danielowitz and Elbow would call it, right? Are we looking for kind of a spirit of inquiry in our students' work? Are we looking for curiosity? Are we looking for genuine interest in the subject being pursued, right? Are we more worried about our students taking risks as writers, demonstrating grit and persistence? Again, curiosity, those are those habits of mind that I mentioned at the very beginning of my part of the talk, right? Outcomes are generally most effective and tell us the most when they're factored into routine department-wide norming. I don't know if you all have done some grade norming, but department-wide assessment is usually when outcomes are most useful, right? When you can actually get together as a large group and evaluate hundreds of student papers, you know, year after year and figure out patterns, right? And then finally, we have to kind of ask ourselves, what is the purpose of a first year writing course, right? Is it, again, a gatekeeping tool? Or are we trying to instill the confidence in our students as writers that they can then take with them to their other more writing intensive classes, right? Are we trying to give them access to tools and resources that they can have to be more successful in college, right? So we have a couple of maybe competing philosophies about first year composition there. And so we have to be really intentional about what it is we're trying to do in the classroom. Faculty anxiety in terms of defining labor, right? So labor really just means any physical or cognitive action needed in the learning process for a writing or literacy course. So that involves reading, writing, revising, active engagement, whatever that means, however you define it, utilizing resources, and simply showing up, right? Actually being present in class, participating in discussion boards, engaging in peer review, right? Being on time. Again, those habits that cultivate a higher chance of success both in college contexts and professional contexts beyond. Practicality. Now, labor-based grading is labor-intensive, pun intended, right? It is difficult if you're an instructor because you have to provide an assload of robust formative feedback, right? It can't just be good, great, excellent, right? All of those kind of typical things that we may associate with, you know, just a passing kind of regard for our students' papers. Doing this effectively does require time and effort, right? But the thing that you do have to remember is you can take a more inquiry-driven approach to feedback, right? A lot of what scholarship on labor-based grading suggests is asking questions of students, right? Asking questions about their thought process, why they chose to phrase something a particular way, why they chose to include or leave out certain contexts, so forth and so on, right? So it takes a lot of effort, right, to provide thoughtful praise, foregrounding, encouraging feedback. So it's not always easy to do when you're teaching, 3, 4, 5 sections of comp, and have a larger kind of a student body in your class, right? And so something that you can use to sort of alleviate some of that pressure is the fact that you don't have to comment on everything. Those of you who work in writing center contexts also know that you don't want to mark every error on a paper, right? There's few things as demoralizing as kind of noting every mistake that you've made in a paper as a student writer, right? As far as scaffolding and prep work for an assignment go, you can, if something is done, it's done, and you can check it off and then worry about the more substantive feedback when you get to a final draft, right? So there are workarounds for, again, the amount of time that you'll need for a labor-based approach. Quality. Now, again, labor-based grading is about making things as streamlined for you as it is for your students. Quality can really factor in when you're talking about grades that are higher than the default or lower than the default, right? And something that I like to articulate in my labor-based grading contracts is I know when you've put in sufficient effort, right? You're all kind of astute readers. You all know when something's been slapped together and when something was done thoughtfully, right? And so when I see outstanding effort, I recognize it. And those are the papers that tend to go above that default, right? So quality is not something that you have to leave out of your assessment in a labor-based system, as Dr. Daniel pointed out. And then there's hybridity, right? You can blend traditional grading and labor-based grading, right? If you have kind of point values associated with things, that's something that people do. I do it myself. Next semester, I'm going to try a purely kind of unilateral labor-based system, but I've usually gone the hybridity route myself. Power dynamics. This is something that I didn't want to ignore, right? Student agency is a big thing, especially if, again, we're trying to empower our students, right? We want to give them a sense of capacity to do things, right? And especially when it comes to the workload and requirements of a course, right, in that initial negotiation phase, right, students can literally tell you the amount of work that they're willing to put in for the grade that they want. And so that might be a level of power that your students are not accustomed to. It helps us democratize the classroom further, right? There's that whole notion of decentering the writing classroom that folks like Peter Elbow are major proponents of, right? Mara Holt, who's my dissertation advisor, also strongly believes in kind of collaborative learning and democratizing the classroom space. So these are philosophies and composition that still enjoy quite a bit of currency, right? We are always interested in creating a more equitable classroom environment. And then finally, remember, you're still the instructor in the end of the day, right? Simply by merit of standing in front of the class, having your name at the top of the syllabus, and the fact that you are evaluating them, right, in various points and ways throughout the term, there is always going to be that uneven power balance, right? So you do still have control over your own class, even if it feels like you're giving up some of that control. And you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing. So just some things that I always feature in my labor-based contracts. I have a general philosophy statement. That's usually the first thing in my contracts, right? Is background on labor-based grading practices and why they work, right? Or why they're a good thing. I have a class culture statement, which Dr. Inouye might call a charter for compassion, but it's basically my expectations for interpersonal conduct and classroom discourse. So, what are the rules of engagement, if you want to call it that, in our class, right? You have to come at questions from a point of curiosity and genuine interest, not hostility, right? We don't yell at each other. We don't use insults in our exchanges with each other, right? I have a language diversity statement and specific grading practices relating to grammar, usage, mechanics, and punctuation, right? I try to take a plurilingual outlook, and this is where anti-racism also factors in. Those of you who read Vershawn Ashanti Young's Should Writers Use They Own English recognize that we blend dialects and and other language bases routinely when we speak, and even occasionally when we write too, right, in both public genres as well as more academic genres. And so my language diversity statement states explicitly, I will not dock points if you choose to bring in one of your other languages, right? If you choose to write in a way that reflects your speech patterns, so forth and so on, I'm not going to knock off points. I may ask questions, right? If I don't understand something, I may ask for clarification, but you're not going to lose any credit for writing in AAL in my class, right? And I also don't grade on grammar. I do try to teach grammar in context if I notice certain patterns among my students' writing, but generally I don't believe in grading what you're not teaching. So if you don't have a unit dedicated to mechanics, you probably shouldn't be grading on mechanics, right? At least that's the way that I think about it. So I try not to factor in grammar and usage and mechanics. There are some things that I'm a little rigid about, like just using spell check is a pretty basic one for me, but even there I'm pretty flexible. Again, I always have an exact grading schema for what constitutes a B. I explain the difference between formative and summative feedback. And then grade negotiation is always a part of my labor-based grading contracts. And I got that from Richard Ugelski's practice of basically giving students the opportunity to contest a grade if they think they've been unfairly graded. Granted, not super practical when you're teaching, hundreds of students, but if you've got a couple of comp sections of 20 students, really shouldn't be that much of a problem. And then there's some references, but that's my spiel.
A couple of questions, actually. So you, in your standard schema, the B is the default, and then you give students an A for like outstanding work or additional effort. Yeah.
Generally, yeah. I don't always do that. So in one of my more recent, I teach racial discourses classes sometimes. So in one of my racial discourses classes, it was another kind of hybrid style contract. So I didn't have a default grade in that class. I had my basic schema was E, M, PM, and M. Exceeded, met, partially met, not met. And so, again, I had a clear breakdown of if you get an exceeded on, at least 3 or 4 major projects and then do 90% of all the other kind of course requirements, you're guaranteed an A in this class, so forth and so on. So I haven't always used default grades, but when I first started as a teaching associate like y'all, I did use a standard B default grade for several years.
Just one other question too. I never thought about this until you were talking, but you were talking about sort of the outcomes of a first year comp class being, do we want students to write sort of like clean papers, right? Or do we want them to be more curious, more critically engaged? Have you thought about like what that would look like in terms of assessment? Like what evidence we could produce that we've produced more like curious writers or more like intellectually interested people or something like that?
And that's where I think like department-wide assessment becomes most useful. In the most recent department assessment that I participated in at my previous institution, that was one of the things that perhaps we had neglected a little bit, was really articulating what our criteria for effective use of evidence was, right? Or kind of critical engagement was. So maybe that's something that when we, start doing our assessment, we can account for.
Yeah, cool.
And
I can speak to that a little bit, Josh, in the way that I've done in my own writing classes. So like, how do we measure, the question is, if you didn't put here, how can we measure or create some ways of assessing when students are engaging a task with more curiosity or with more effort, right? So in the current classes that I'm teaching, same thing. All assignments default more or less to a B. But if the student wants to achieve an A, they can do the traditional route of just like, I hope I did really great, but they can also choose to do an additional intellectual task related to the assignment, right? So for example, right now, my students are doing a sort of literature review type assignment where they're writing about a conception of writing that's important to them, right? Something like you have to be a genius in order to be a writer, and like trying to debunk that by doing some research around that. But to get an A, they have the option to do an additional intellectual task and integrate that into their writing. So the additional task is they can go and interview 2 friends or family about their beliefs around this task, around this conception, like you have to be a genius. And then they integrate those interviews into their writing so that it shows to me I took special interest in learning more about this and exploring this from more diverse perspectives, and then in thinking through that in my writing. And so then it adds a couple hundred words to the word count if they do this as well. So they have additional space to do it. But it gives them an opportunity to say, I wanted to do more and I was more curious about this thing, right? Like I had more, I was more motivated to explore this and really think about it. And the thinking is reflected in my writing and the work that I produce. So it's not just an exercise in like produce more words, but it's that they're engaging in a task more deeply, thinking about it from more perspectives, engaging more material on the idea, and then using that to form more ideas in their writing.
That's dope. I'm gonna try that.
And what's funny, like you speak about, agency, right? Like I would say maybe 20% of my students do this. 20% of my students choose to do the A grade task.
Sure.
Some of them get the A anyways because they're just great. But the other ones, they buy in and like, okay, a B is what I want, and I'm going to make my deliberate choice. I assume, anyway, it's deliberate choice to just be okay with that level of work and that effort. So they can invest their resources as they choose, knowing where that's going to be. They still have to achieve something to get a B. It's not, so easy. They can get C's. They have gotten D's before for failing to do various things. But they have their ability to know and say, if I do X work, then I can get this grade. And if I don't care about getting that A, well, then I can allocate my resources elsewhere and I have that agency.
Will these resources be shared with us?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, we will.
Because I was going to ask how you would evaluate what exactly qualifies for going above and beyond, but yeah, it's a really great system.
I have a question. How do you measure quality?
That's a good question. And again, that's where something like what Dr. Paz mentioned, right? A demonstrated level of effort above and beyond what was expected, right? So, I think when students produce writing that reveals a genuine curiosity in what it is that they're doing, that usually tells me something, right? So when students share their own exigence related to a topic and really dive deeply, right, and have a sustained kind of dialogue with me in their writing, right, that to me tells me that the student is genuinely engaged in the task, right, whereas student who just submits kind of a threadbare product, right, one that it's pretty clear that they're just trying to meet the word count, doesn't really show a further sophistication of thought on the subject, surface level treatment of whatever topic it is that they're doing, right? That's usually how I gauge quality for me. So really for me, it's about things like originality to a degree, right? But also, how far did you go, right? Did you interview family members or folks in your circle and integrate that into your writing? Because that's not, primary research like that is not always something that we expect of our students. But if they did that, that's dynamite.
Yeah, oddly, I found it easier to gauge that teaching asynchronous courses, because often the students that are doing more like the way they're communicating with you is through email. So you get like lots of emails from a student, which just shows they're like thinking about the assignment, they're talking to family members, or talking to friends. And you can see it reflected through the word doing things that you didn't ask for.
I'd say too, one of the like beautiful things about labor-based assessment is that you feel less pressure to have to justify like an evaluation of quality, right? Like, I think that how many experiences in traditional grading schema where I have to justify the grade, right? And I have to create an evaluation and feedback that shows you were X amount of bad and X amount of good, and in the grand scale of things that comes up to a B. Whereas this removes a lot of the pressure to say you have X level of quality and therefore you got this grade. Now your focus is on giving feedback. And that feedback doesn't have to be, you might say the same thing to your students doing any sort of analysis, right? This feedback doesn't have to be this is good or this is bad. That feedback can be, here's where I could have seen more analysis happen. Here's where I would have liked more detail in your narrative. Here's where getting support from an additional source would have really added depth, whatever it might be, right? So you don't have to talk about quality in these nebulous ways. You can now be very specific in the feedback in a way that you're no longer worried about saying like, I have to make sure the student understands what he got B. You're saying now I have to understand the student, I have to explain to the student how their writing can continue to improve and grow, and that's your only concern. So now, your rubrics and things like that are all just communicating ways to grow rather than ways to get X amount of grades, right? And so this question of like, how do we justify or explain quality takes a whole different perspective now because you're responding in a totally different way.
Like the way I like to think about it is, right, work is either done or it's not done. You turn something in, it met basic expectations, check, right? You accumulate enough of those, you have a B, and as Dr. Paz put it, right, your focus becomes more on a growth kind of model of providing feedback.
So you said like the work is done, it met X amount of expectations. But you've also said that there are students who, and I apologize because maybe you covered this and I came in late for my last class and didn't hear it, but they met X amount of expectations, but that there's some students who don't get that grade because they don't meet those expectations. How do you differentiate what does and does not meet the expectations? And I'll give a concrete example. Right now I'm working in the evaluation unit and I told my students, you can't just give me your evaluation, you also need to explain your reasoning and support with evidence. What if I have one student who just gives an evaluation with no explanation? One student who gives an evaluation and an explanation, but it's like one sentence that's like, I gave it this evaluation because I thought they did a good job. And then I have one student who gives an evaluation, but has like a whole paragraph following with quotes supporting, and it's really detailed. And all three, technically they're giving an evaluation, but the way that they justify it further is very different.
Sure. Well, I would say that first student that you mentioned likely isn't meeting expectations, right? Simply because they didn't include evidence, right? And even if they didn't wax, at length about their evidence, they just didn't actually include any. So that's a basic criteria that you can say was not met, right? It's the same deal, right? Features a thesis that adequately explains their legs of analysis, right? If they have forecasting of some kind that plays out what their analytical criteria will be, even if it's not the most sophisticated thesis in the world, I still count it as being done. But if, say, they've written their introductory paragraphs and there's no clear argument or no clear forecasting, then for me, that's a criteria that hasn't been met. So it's really about what's present and what's not present for me.
But what about in the other two cases where both of them provide some amount of explanation, but the quality and depth of the explanation is significantly different? Is that the middle student getting that B and the other student getting that A from there?
That's where, right, my kind of partially, so I have usually a kind of 4-part grading schema of exceeded, met, partially met, and not met. And so in an instance where a student is kind of treading that line between meeting and not meeting, I'll usually give them a partially met. And, the way that my rubrics play out, if you've attended to however many major criteria and have met them, and then balance that against the minor criteria and meeting them, right? So that's when, they'll usually get a B on a paper, right? Or an evaluation of the equivalent of a MET, right? So yeah, in those instances, that's where quality kind of plays in for me, is when a student has done like really outstanding work on all expectations, then they get a higher grade for sure. So
In
Um,
addition to providing us this presentation, would you also be willing to give us a sample rubric so we can see that breakdown of
Oh, most
net
definitely.
and partially net?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, let's put together a whole folder of like different grading contracts from different levels and things like that. I have ones for different courses and those kinds of things.
I have an example I'd like to show as well.
Yeah.
If that's fine. Yeah. Because like as hesitant as we are as instructors to adopt this method of evaluation for the students, like the students are equally hesitant, if not more so. Like this is a room full of really smart people, and we're still trying to figure out like all of the intricacies of this ourselves. So I wanted to show an example that I gave my students, and this is the evaluation essay prompts that I gave them. It's fairly standard with the overview and requirements, and then there's a grading rubric here that is a traditional metric that I showed them. Okay, and it's all of the parts of these that, all of the parts of the essay that need to be met to get X number of points. Okay, and then the alternative I gave them was this here. And I found that color coding this helped the students visualize and understand conceptually what I was asking them to do. I was telling them that this unit still has like the same steps that we would go through, but they could choose to be graded on a contract where they still have to do a rough draft peer review and a final draft, but then there are these attached fields here that are labor log menus, or excuse me, labor log memos. And these I think would be similar to what Dr. Paz was talking about, where he would have supplements to the assignment that you could get like a higher grade. So I told the students that, Unit 3 has 3 weeks of instruction, so we have 9 classes since we're Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I can guarantee them a B grade if they complete all of the blue fields and all of the red fields and come to, what did I tell them? 7 classes out of 9. All right. And then the option to get an A grade instead of a B grade was to complete all of these fields, but then have an additional field as well, which would be a writing center visit or an office hours appointment. And then there was no memo attached to that. And then the class meeting time requirement was up to 8 from 7. So the color-coded breakdown, I think, really helped the students get around what was expected of them, and they didn't really have to worry about the metrics that would be involved in like meeting the expectations of the assignment. Now, I showed the students this twice because even what I thought was like a really simple breakdown of the expectations, they just could not get their minds around it. 100% of them opted to go for a traditional like metric grading system the first time. And then they were, at the end, they were like, okay, explain it again, the next day. And I went through it, and 100% of them opted for this as well. And I don't know if I want to make this exact correlation, but it's evident in this unit. So like a lot of people in the room, we've had a total drop off in attendance this year. It might have started strong at the beginning of the semester and then dipped in the middle of the semester. Some have recovered and some have not in terms of attendance. I had the same thing in my courses, so that for Unit 2, my attendance was terrible. It's the worst it's ever been, and I didn't know what to attribute that to. And that's one reason that I offered this alternate grading rubric, was because I thought the attendance expectations were made very plain. It forced the students to have accountability, given that it's really a contract that they're signing to do this. And I don't know if I can totally attribute this to my increase in attendance or not, but I'm back to 75% attendance for this unit. And I mean, it's a small sample size on which to gauge that, but I do think it's been helpful in that regard.
Is there a way for you to, like, let's say a student did all of this except they didn't do the peer review? Is there a way for you to know how much less than a B grade they'll get for that versus if they did all of it but they didn't do the rough draft, or the, like, how much they lose for each expectation they're not meeting?
Yeah, I did let them know that this is negotiable in a sense. And in the contract that they signed, which I did not include here, like a B has a wide range to it. I mean, a B minus and a B plus is a huge range. And so I think I told them that, and this only applied to the red fields here for the labor log menus. Completing those or not can take you from a B minus to a B to a B plus. And this is something Dr. Johnson referred to as time logs. I like thinking of these as labor logs with a time component, because what I'm expecting the students to do in the labor log memos is to give a description of what their writing process was for each part of that assignment. And this isn't all just like metacognitive reflection. I guess it is maybe in a watered down sense. I want them to include things like what kind of distractions they had while they were writing, where they were writing, how long they were writing, and what other resources they were using at the same time. Because if they're making themselves aware of those conditions and the choices they're making, then that really is going to make them more intentional with the environment or situation that they put themselves in to actually be able to write and to get things on paper.
So
Yes.
I'm gonna ask
Yeah.
a follow-up question. So, because you had said that there's gradations of a B, that like if there's, just one thing, it can maybe be a B minus. If they've got all of it, it can get up to a B plus. But again, if they need to have that stuff to have a B, and they have most but not all of that stuff, does that drop them down to a C? And do you have a standardized system to figure out how much less they get if they're not meeting expectations?
I mean, the blue fields, so completing like the rough draft, a peer review, and a final draft, like I basically consider it it has to be a Met requirement. They have to do that. A lot of the labor that goes into that assignment is often going to be reflected in the labor log memo. But if they're not meeting the conditions of these fields, then yeah, I mean, it could drop them down below a B to a C, and then we would maybe be relying more on traditional metrics there.
I've been pretty rigid and stuff like that, especially the scaffolding for individual assignments. So for the rhetorical analysis unit, I made it a requirement that they would go to the writing center, and I would need to receive a confirmation report from their tutor. And in my final grade breakdown, I said, if you don't schedule a writing center appointment or some kind of alternative, right, then the highest grade you can earn on this paper is a Met evaluation, regardless of the quality of your writing. So yeah, just basic things that absolutely have to be met before they can earn less or more, right?
I would caution you all to not make everything so like divisible, where like you can track like 2 points for this, 2 points for this, 2 points for that, 2 points for that, because then you get back into number crunching, and that can be very difficult, right? So depending on how you formulate the language in the contract or whatever, and I don't know how you did this, Ross, yourself, but like in my class, right, like I don't mess with pluses or minuses. It's just like you get a B, you get a C, you get an A. Pluses and minuses could be a really great way to add some gradation on there, right? I don't think that's wrong at all, but like saying to each of these things, well, if you have, 8 out of the 8, here you get 7 out of the 8, like, and then attaching a numeric value to each of those can be really, really difficult for you because then you're hunting down and tracking. Students are like, can I turn it in late? All this sorts of, it kind of adds a lot of flavor on top of the fact that this is already a laborious process if you're really attaching to it. I mean, from my perspective, if I were running something like this, I would say like, this is the guarantee to get a B, right? Like, this is our contract. Like, all I'm guaranteeing you is if you do these things, attend the class meetings, which I think is a great thing that you added there. The class meetings thing was really smart. And I wanted to recognize that. You submit all of these things, you will get somewhere in the range of the B with some allowances for minuses and pluses. If you don't meet that contract, though, and the contract is broken, then that contract is no longer applicable, and we're reverse to the traditional grading standard because that's what we have to go on, right? When you try to get into then like, okay, but how do I then break apart your C's, or how do I get you down to a D using this style of thing? You're already working outside of the bounds of the contract, right? So use this kind of like the labor-based stuff for what it really works well for, which is when students either do the thing or they don't do the thing. If you try to use it as a complete and total replacement for everything along the scale, it might be you'll get really detailed in a way that's just going to be really hard for you, I think.
Okay, I mean, 'cause that's what, like, every time about labor-based assessment, that's what I've been kind of like hitting up against, is because, like, especially right now, both of the classes that I'm working in are full restricted classes with academically at-risk students. So like,
Sure.
I'm not getting them, like, at large, I'm not getting them to meet expectations. So this almost isn't realistic for me.
Yeah.
And I was like, how do I make sure that I'm still giving them equitable grades when they're not meeting expectations? But this idea that, like, if they're not meeting the contract, then the contract is broken and we have to revert to a different grading system, that, like, finally is making it click for me, the difference in those two systems.
Yeah. And I mean, that's really up to you, right? In the way that you set it up in the contract, right? Like, you could choose to become so divisible in terms of like each of the little grading criteria, but that would make things hard.
Yeah.
And again, so you might recall, I think I mentioned to some of you this, that I'm doing a really like highly AI intensive section of my courses, and so from the very first day, I told them, here's what an A means in my course, here's what a B means in my course, here's what a C means in my course for each of my assignments, and that is applying broadly, but like a C for most of my students is like, it would be like the first student that you described in your example of all the different evaluations, right? Like, you did the thing in the barest of minimum ways, right? And if they like don't meet any of those expectations, if they don't meet requirements, right, they go to a D and all of those things. And then each assignment has some more specifics in each of those types of ways. But if we get into a point where you're creating alternative rubrics where what am I trying to say? I lost myself in my own cooking. If you go through the process of creating these intensely intricate rubrics for students, I think you're going to overwhelm them, right? Anyways, and so you're going to lose a lot of the wonderful potential of this sort of material in terms of your labor and in terms of your just like mental health. Right.
Which is primarily why I wanted to show this, because I mean, students have spent 18 years of their lives being evaluated with traditional metrics of grading, and so to introduce contract-based grading to them is something that they're just not used to seeing. So to make like a simple visual illustration to show them what they need to do to meet expectations, I think was helping get their minds around it.
And I mean, like a piece of this too, which can work in a variety of ways, is the negotiation, right? Like, you negotiate so that when you do this in your class and you say, here's the material and the criteria that you've laid out, right, wonderfully here and colorfully, the students are agreeing to this. They're buying in. They have the agency to say, I think this is reasonable and I will stand by that. We can agree this is what I need to do to get a B. And so if they don't meet those criteria and then they come to you, you have agreed on something together that we both said that this was fair and rational and reasonable. We didn't meet this. It's not any longer like, if there's the emotional tax of your responsibility to try to justify or say like, okay, well, let me work with you to get this. You can do that if you'd like, by all means, but you agreed on this together. It wasn't you who imposed it either. You negotiated and created a set of standards that the student said from the beginning, I agree that this is what I need to do. And then if they don't meet that, well, mean, at some point, there's gotta be consequences, right?
That's a great point too, because it aligns so much with the epidemic of absenteeism we have now. I mean, like, what is the level of accountability that the student has, and who are they accountable to? You know, they're away from home for the first time, so they probably don't feel as accountable in that regard. No one is forcing them to get up in the morning and go to class. No one is forcing them to do this work, but if you've made it plain that you have a negotiation here and a contract in which you've agreed on a grade beforehand, and how many class meetings they have to attend to achieve that, that is something very concrete that they have to be accountable to.
Accountable to themselves, right?
Accountable to themselves,
Yeah.
more than anything.
They've already established a standard for themselves.
In fact, I think I used that phrase in the last paragraph, that they have to be accountable to themselves. Yeah. But there's so many ways. I mean, there's so many ways you.
Another thing I would add to all this, like, when you get into the nitty gritty of all of this, right? Like, okay, what do I have to do? Like, it can seem very overwhelming. Don't let that stop you from trying it. Right? If you feel like you have to do all of this labor to get, I have to get the perfect formulation of this, the syllabus, the perfect rubrics all laid out, and if I don't get that all done, I can't do this sort of thing. Any construct you make is always going to be rocky and shaky the first time you teach it. That's okay. But the benefits of this sort of thing, right, especially for your students in terms of equity and fairness and accessibility for what they're going to get in the classroom, even if it's a messy system at first that you like work the kinks out of in the first time that you're going through it,
Yep.
It's going to be worth it for them and for you in a lot of ways probably. Don't get caught up trying to, in perfectionism before you allow yourself to do this, because it would be far better for your students to go through, a 75% way, a system of this that's only 75% of the way there. But then you have more students passing, more students getting success, more students feeling like they have some space in the classroom to negotiate and work through problems that they're having and make you feel more acceptable as an instructor than to wait until you perfected it and, serve all of those students less than meanwhile just holding on to the traditional standards because you're not sure how to do this. And we have a wonderful support system of people who will help you do all of this stuff. So, I would really encourage you to thoughtfully, take it up, try it, but don't be discouraged or intimidated by it because it will help in the end.
Yeah. If you wait till all of the contradictions and problems are ironed out before you put something in place, it'll be past the time to do it anyway. Yeah.
Much more. Thank you.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, I am actively changing my current labor-based contract, right? It's a living document, all of them are. So there are always going to be like little nuances I add and take away year after year. So I'm still trying new things out.
I mean, this is for anyone, I'm just staring at a point. But I've had some students who have, like, for one reason or another, like, fallen behind, and then they come back to me and, I have a lot of students who, like, have to work or just various life situations and stuff. And like, in some of those instances, they actually do come to office hours and they do, like, try to get back on track and put the work in. And I guess I'm wondering how you, like, take that into account and apply it to the labor-based, like, even if they're not meeting the, like, the deadline of that aspect of meeting the requirements, like, how you incorporate that into this mode of assessment.
Any thoughts here? I mean, you can do it by unit, right? With like, I said in one of the 502 classes, like for your different grading categories, what you can do is describe the work that you imagine a B student, a C student, or A student would do, and that can include attendance. I mean, you can have your own sort of like you see in my policies, there's a forgiveness week policy, right? They've got like 3 of those. So for me, that more than covers anything that I'm reasonably willing to do, right? You miss 3 weeks, you can just sort of check those in. Yeah, I mean, you got to define them according to what's not going to drive you totally nuts and what's within your labor load. And also, I mean, you guys see, like, part of my approach in the program is like, whenever you're going to grade student papers or whatever you're thinking about a student, I want the thought in your head to be like, can I pass this student? Like, I want you to lean toward generosity toward the student, right? There's no doubt that that causes instructors who are well-meaning too much emotional energy and sort of get burned out and taken advantage of by the students. So this is something we have to figure out, and it's something, you know, in between like my rah-rah approach and you're like, oh yeah, but I've got 8 students who are really behind and they're kind of making me nuts, right? So we've got to find more solutions there and sort of codify them into practice, because I can see it in a number of you. And this approach, like you can sink as much as you want into it, and it's hard for anybody who's a decent person to sit in a room with these students and not want to help them, right? Yeah, but you're all students too, people.
And if, you know, the student is making an active attempt at redemption, if you want to call it that, right? Sometimes I go the way that my conscience moves me, right? And I go with what's going to help me sleep at night. And I've had instructors take that sort of mercy on me before, right? Of giving me the grade that they think I deserve as opposed to the grade that I earned, right? So, and yeah, that takes a lot of emotional energy and investment, but
It does.
that's something that
It does, and you'll also get stuff from, I think Itzel got one of these the other day, like advisors who like track a student down, and they like will email you and then they'll email me to try to get me to tell you to like let the student back in. There's a lot of pressure here because the university's trying to keep its footing, it's trying to grow, and it's trying to keep these students, right? But you still have to hold to your values. I think another thing people tell you, one second, another thing people will tell you is like, don't do anything for one student you wouldn't do for any student. And that's true in some sense, like at least in theory, you would do this for any student, but support what David says of like, what does your conscience tell you? What does your relationship with the student tell you about sort of like what affordances you're going to make to them? I think a lot of times those sort of cliches can just allow you to just not do anything for any student, right? What you saying, Amy?
Oh, well, actually, I was gonna say that's part of my presentation, so
Oh,
I don't know if we like,
Yeah.
I don't wanna like insert the transition, but if it's,
While she's moving up there, I'll say that, one of the things that's in my syllabus, and then I hit really hard in the first couple of weeks, is that as long as the student is communicating with me, I can make anything happen, right? If you're emailing me ahead of the time saying you're having trouble making the deadline,
like one
if you're emailing me ahead of time saying, I don't tell the student this, but if a student emails me for whatever reason, they don't have to tell me the reason, and it's like, I'm not gonna be in class today, I don't mark it as an absence, like, within reason, right? Like, eventually, if they miss half this class, like, things are gonna happen, but if they're telling me, if they're talking with me, it's anything is possible. We can make adaptations, we can, like, add, as, like, in contract language, we can add memorandums onto the contracts and, like, change those things. They're coming to office hours, they're engaged, they're still doing the labor, they're still doing the work, right? Like they're still showing you, I'm here, I'm engaged, I'm thinking about these things, I want to do these things, I'm trying to do good work. I'm going to accept that as part of this contract that we've set up or that we've established, this understanding that we've set up. And it's when someone tries to get all of that compassion and mercy out of you all at once and you've never heard from them, you know, for 8 weeks, things become very, very difficult, right? So I try really hard to inform students that as long as you're showing me that you're present and that you're still trying to maintain plugged in, whatever is going on in between there, and then I don't even have to know what it is, but as long as you're still trying and communicating with me, I can make magic happen anywhere.
Yeah. And you know what? Instructors ask me a lot. Am I being a pushover? Like I'm doing this for this student, doing this for that student? And it just like, I'm usually nice in responding to those questions, but like, you know what a pushover is? It's like, well, it's not like it's policy in the story, right? Like, you're not being a pushover if you're willing to do more work or you're at least willing to consider thinking of the student as a human being, right? That's just being decent and be good years to go.
I guess that's me. So when we were talking about like doing this presentation, I was like, I think part of some of the concerns about grading is that the people who are in my year who are returning students, like, so I'll back up. The people who are in their third year or more of the program learned the system one way. The people who are in my year who are returning students in their second year learned that same system, but with some amount of flexibility. And then the people who are new this year are in the process of like jumping into a system that's changing. So we're all kind of like speaking a different language in terms of like rubrics and expectations and like the rules that we were taught. And so I had pitched to Dr. Daniel, I was like, what if I just like say like here's what we had been doing and here's kind of where we're at now, and then talked about like how I've personally been trying to like find a middle ground between the two without fully doing labor-based assessment, because up until like literally you saw me, I had like an aha moment and I was like, oh, now it makes sense, thank God. But I haven't been doing it until then because I was like, I don't feel like I get that. So just so like for the people who have been here before, this is what was in our base syllabus, is the syllabi that we were given last year. And for the people who are new, when you're talking to your mentors and they're like, oh, well, before, this is what they're talking about. Just, I'm not saying this is what you should be doing. I'm glad it's gone, but so that we understand like kind of where we're coming from. Originally, the late work policy in our base syllabus was that anything that you turn in late, as soon as it's late, you can take away 5% of the grade, and then every 24 hours it's late after that, another 5% of the grade is gone. So a student could turn in a paper 2 days late and lose 10% of their grade, like off the bat. There was a tardiness policy that was anything where they're like leaving early or coming in late within 10 minutes. And there were some teachers who, this isn't quoted in the old syllabus, but who would add up a certain number of tardies to equal an unexcused absence. And then the attendance policy, we had something called absence failure, which was essentially if they miss a certain number of classes with unexcused absences, they would automatically fail the class. For a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, that was 9. For a Tuesday, Thursday class, that was 6 classes. And we were given a really rigid grading scheme to use, which allowed us essentially 20 points of wiggle room per unit. So we had units 1 through 4, because there was an additional paper that we had to do. Units 1 through 4 were 10% of the grade, 100 points for the unit. And then we were told that the final draft had to be 50 of those 100 points. And that we were also required to give them a rough draft assignment, a peer review assignment, and then a post-write assignment, which is kind of akin to the labor-based like self-assessment reflection after the writing, but it was a lot more structured and I think probably less helpful for the students, but it had some of the same ideas in mind. But each of those were supposed to be 20 points. So for those of, or for, sorry, 10 points. For those of us who are doing the math, 50 points for a paper, 10 points for 3 assignments, that brings us to 80, which again meant that there were 20 points per unit that the instructors had for wiggle room for their own assignments. So everything was incredibly rigid, and we already had like a plan that we were kind of following. And then half of their grade came in at unit 5 at the end of the semester, where they did a reflective revision assignment that we called a portfolio, which essentially was they picked 3 of the 4 papers they had just written and revised all of them, and then wrote an additional paper reflecting on their revision process. And that was worth half of their grade and was also turned in at the end of the semester, which nobody liked. And then they also had a final that was another 10% of their grade, which was another reflective thing. So by the end of the semester, they're writing 6 like large assignments plus a bunch more smaller assignments that was up to the professor's discretion. So you had some people who were like, okay, I've got 20 points to work with, I'll give them 2 smaller 10 points like free writing assignments. And you had other professors who were doing like, I'm going to give them 4 smaller assignments for like reading reflections. And so depending on which teacher you got, you were doing sometimes double or quadruple the amount of extra busy work that your other peers were doing. So for those of you who have been around, I'm glad that we're not doing this anymore, but for those of you who are newer and you're hearing us talk to each other about what was, so that this gives you a concrete idea of what we're talking about. Some parts of this, I'm not gonna lie, like even though at large suck, some parts of it were helpful just in the sense that like it took some of the decision making off of our shoulders because there was kind of an expectation set. But you can still do that for yourself and give your students more flexibility at the same time. You can set decisions, like you can be like, I want to do peer review for every unit and I want it to be this part of their grade without making it quite so rigid like this. I made some changes, and then again, last year we were given some flexibility, but we weren't sure like how far we could run with it. So there were some changes that I made immediately last year because I hated that. And there's some things that I've expanded on through that. So last year I gave everyone a 24-hour grace period for all assignments, where I was like, if you get it in within a day of the deadline, you still get full points, no questions asked. This semester, I've extended that to 48 hours. And then when I set my deadlines, I think about that intentionally. So I'm like, okay, if I tell them that it's due Friday night, I'm going to get a bunch of things on Sunday because that's, you know, two days later. But that, especially because like I'm working with a lot of students who are struggling with late work, that gives both of us kind of that bubble, you know, where like they will see the deadline on D2L and they'll be like, oh shit, I got to get it in. It's already a day late. But I will know I don't have to worry about their late work because it's still in when I've said I expected it from them ultimately because they have that grace period. So that's something that's been really helpful for me. I also like have decided this semester that if they get their work in by the end of the unit, I will give them the grade for it, but I won't accept late work after the unit because they need to move on and I need to move on. Unless there's an extenuating situation, they've got like an extension or something. That way, again, that's different from last year where it was like late work for every deadline. Like I'm just like, get it in and then we're gonna move on. And then I have a really specific, this is why I wanted to talk about this, because we were talking about how do we have policies for our students that are both flexible but consistent. So as an example of that, this is my policy for giving them extensions. If your work will be turned in later than the grace period, you have until the end of the grace period to email me, inform me that your work will be late, and offer me a new deadline by which you think you can reasonably accomplish the work. Note, this says a deadline by which you think you can reasonably accomplish the work. If you think I would rather you get the work done in 1 day, but you really need 2 days, ask for 2 days. Advocating for yourself does not require considering what an authority figure hypothetically prefers. I will email you back to approve your extended deadline or renegotiate it if I disagree with your requested period. When I confirm the new deadline, it will grant you an extension for the assignment. This is my policy for all of my students. This accomplishes a couple different things. This requires them to communicate with me. This requires them to consider their own time management skills. And this requires them to practice advocating for themselves in a safe space. This also takes the pressure off of me to decide how much time they each need because they're telling me themselves. And this puts all of it in writing so that if you forget, you can look their name up in your email and boom, it's written down for you. That also makes them practice putting things in writing. So, because when I'm talking, part of the reason I was like, I was hesitant with this labor-based thing until, again, I was sitting here today and I was like, oh, thank God I get it now. Is because I'm really, I mean, those of you who are in my mentor group, you know this, like I'm really, really staunch on like, we need to give students both equality and equity in the way that we approach things. Having policies like this accomplishes this because they all have equal access to this opportunity, but they can set equitable deadlines depending on what they need, right? Because the student who like is like deathly sick and like hacking up half a lung is probably going to need more extra time than the student who like got scheduled for a last minute shift, but they'll get it in by the morning, right? And they get to set those their own deadlines. And that also follows through with
what Dr. Paz was just saying about as long as they're communicating with me, I can, perform magic. This puts the onus on them to communicate with you. And it puts it in, this is in my syllabus, right? So if I have students who, because I've had that this semester, I've had students who have missed a month of classes because of illness, but they've kept talking to me and they're doing well. I've also had students who have not emailed me once and then showed up a month later and they're like, why am I not passing? And I'm like, why haven't I heard from you? Right? Um, so then there's not as much. The tardiness policy I totally ignored. I didn't like it. I do mark when I'm keeping track of attendance. I do mark when I see students walking in crazy late, mostly just so that when I conference with them, I can be like, hey, I noticed that you've been walking in late and you're missing half of class regularly, so you're not getting the instruction. How can we make a plan to keep you successful? But I don't use it as a punitive measure. I also, for their attendance policy, same thing. If you communicate with me, I can perform magic. I like that line. So my attendance policy is that I will excuse any absence as long as you email me within 3 days of the absence, letting me know that you couldn't be there. They don't even need to give me a reason. Like they can literally just email me, I'm not coming. Cool, it's excused. But you emailed me, so I know you have the intent to keep up with the coursework, and then I will respond to them, cool, here's what you missed. I like to the way that I lesson plan with PowerPoint slides. I'm a visual person and it just makes sense to me. So that also makes it easy for me that after class, I'll just upload the PowerPoint slides to their D2L. So usually my response email is, that's awesome, the notes are on D2L. And it takes the onus off of both of us. And then if you have students who are consistently falling behind, you can see whether or not there's that paper trail in your email of have they been communicating with me or not, right? And again, they have equal access to this policy, but their use of it depends on what equity they need, right? Because different students will need different things.
I mean, could you make the text bigger?
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting older.
No, that's okay. I should have thought about accessibility. Yeah, we're seeing it. All right. Okay, yeah. So the grade scheme. I also did like a bunch of, I just typed this all up last night. Again, normally I'm a visual person. I'm so tired. So you're just kind of getting my notes, and I'm sorry about that. I'm not gonna read all of this to you because, like, dear God. But I do want to talk a little bit about how I've sort of straddled everything I'm learning about labor-based assessment and like where I came from with this really rigid grade scheme. So that if any of you feel stuck in the middle, you're not alone. And also, here's an option of what it's looked like for somebody. I'm not saying this is the best thing. It's just what I'm doing. So, like, I feel like I didn't understand labor-based assessment at the beginning of the semester, and I didn't want to attempt something that I didn't understand, like, I felt like at all. So what I did was I looked at the principles of labor-based assessment and then tried to reflect that in a more numeric rubric. So I did like a portfolio grade where I was like, if you do all of this work for the unit, at the end of the unit, you will get a grade for that. I was still grading their papers separately, but the way that I made their rubric was kind of like the labor-based, where it was like, if you meet these expectations, you get these points. I just did that numerically. And like you can see that example here, where like, half of their points is just, did you have a story in your narrative, right? And then you get a certain number of points. Did you use any amount of description in detail? And I told them, I went over this with them, and I told them the onus is like, if you have evidence of it, you will get the points for it because I saw that you put in the effort. I did not have anything with quality. I even said here at the bottom, I was like, we're gonna practice MLA for the first paper and then we'll like do a better job for the second paper. So I was like, you get the points just if I see you attempted it, right? I want to see evidence of effort and you will get graded for effort. It is not about quality. So even though I wasn't doing the labor-based assessment, I was still very clearly pointing out, I was like, these are the skills that you're working on, and I'm grading you for your attempts at the skills, not for the quality of your product, which took a lot of pressure off of them and a lot of pressure off of me. And also because they don't understand contract grading, but they do understand rubrics. This was a really easy way for me to tell them, here's my expectations and what matters to me as your teacher, right? Because so many of my students, I don't know if this is something you've noticed, so many of my students were like quaking in their freaking boots about page count. They're like, oh my God, you're telling me it has to be 4 pages? And I was like, yeah, and you could write one that's 2 and still get to 95% because it is the smallest part of my rubric. I don't care. Write a good story, you're going to get a good grade. And it was a really easy way for me to break that down and show it to them. And I've had to do that every single unit because they don't believe me. They keep getting nervous about this. But this is an easy way for me to show it to them. And I also have like a brief, same with the labor-based assessment. I have a breakdown of like, here's the expectation for an A paper, here's the expectation for a B paper. But instead of setting it as like, you get a B and then you move up, I'm like, you get an A if you meet everything that's in the prompt, B if you meet most of it but not all of it, C and moving forward down. But that way they can see the breakup. One thing I will say that this system has been working okay for me. One thing that I have not liked about it is because I have so many students turning in so much work late, it has been hard for me to motivate them to keep their work in consistently. That might be, again, I'm teaching specific restricted sections with students who are academically at risk. So like I might be having a different experience than most people this semester. But for the first 2 units, it was end of the unit, you get a portfolio grade for all of the assignments that I've given you. And I like wrote them out and broke them down and gave it to them specifically at the beginning of the semester. So kind of the same way, or the beginning of the unit, kind of the same way with labor-based assessment. It's like, here's your contract, do you agree to it? I gave them, I was like, here's your grade scheme. Does this make sense to you? Is there anything that you feel we need to change, or are you comfortable with it? And they said they were, and then I graded accordingly for the rest of the unit. The only problem with this is that when I gave them that one grade at the end of the semester, if they were missing half of these assignments, they weren't seeing zeros go in throughout the unit to let them know that those were missing. And then they were getting bad grades at the end of the unit and being like, why am I missing half these points? I'm like, because you weren't turning in the work. And part of the reason that was a shock to them is because they also had terrible attendance. So maybe that just is what it is. But for this semester, or for this unit, I've tried something different where I'm going back more towards the traditional, and I am putting in individual grades for individual assignments, so that as I'm giving them their feedback through the unit, I'm also putting in a numerical grade, hoping that maybe seeing those zeros in earlier will scare some of them sooner into being like, oh shit, that's missing, let me turn it in. I don't know if that's helped or not yet. I'm going to be totally honest. I'm still kind of in the process of it. I will say that I have seen more students coming up to me and being like, hey, I didn't turn that in, but I saw the 0. Can I get it done now? So I think it's working. I think it's helping get their attention. I don't know. And I don't know what the answer is with all of this, whether it's the lump sum grade at the end is better or the individual. I don't know. But they're struggling, and I'm doing my absolute best to help them out. The last thing that I will say is when we're talking about like how do we have policies and what do we do when it's like, are you willing to do this for every student or not? Do you follow your conscience? The more that you think, this is something I've talked about a lot with my mentees and sometimes with people at PSW. So if you've heard me say it before, I'm sorry, I'm gonna say it again. But the more that you think critically about the way that you phrase your policies from the beginning of the semester to set your expectations with your students, the less you have to think about it later when you get confronted with a challenging situation. If you have a flexible extension policy like the one that I have, if you have somebody who's like, hey, this has happened to me before. My family home, the house just burned down. I need 2 weeks and then I'll get back to you. I can say, okay, because I've already set that up for them as an expectation, right? But if you haven't done that, then you're like, okay, well, I just told this student he could have a week, but now this student wants 2 weeks. Am I even allowed to do that? then you're having to make more of those individual decisions as you go, rather than making it a negotiation with your students from the beginning. And if anybody wants to learn more about any of those kind of specific policies that I have, I'm happy to share them with you. Thank you for listening to me.
Sound like Anya. See how Anya sounds like she's been doing this for like 30 years? You're all gonna sound like that soon too, really. I mean, like, how far you've all come in the space of one semester. Composition theory tells us programs should be built out of local context. They should be built to reflect the values of the people who teach the classes, not just those who administer them. We're building a program from the ground up. I'm asking a lot of you guys. Within a couple of years, this is going to be a program that looks a lot more coherent, but it's going to be made out of the stuff that you guys discover, literally, that you're finding out right now. You know, like some of the ways Anya's talking about policy is really sophisticated. Like, what are your goals? What are you trying to get your students to do? What kind of classroom are you trying to manage? Why would I write a policy at the program level to prevent that from happening, right? Like, you guys are going to know these students better than me. It's my job to listen to you and to put policies in place that keep the program on course. Like, it sounded like we probably need a policy in terms of absence, like no expectations needed at this point. Like, instructors aren't expected to catch their students up after they miss this many dates, right? That's my goal with policy. That's my goal with program building, is to listen to you guys and build a program out of what you know. Anya thinks of stuff I don't think of all the time. You all are going to as well. And I want you to trust me enough to bring it to me and make it part of the program. It'll make the program better. Yeah. That's it. That's for sure. Any big concerns, questions, anything like that? Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for David Johnson, who I'm glad you're all getting to meet now. Excellent. Anya, Ross, everybody, you guys have been amazing this semester. Everybody hang in there. We're almost to the end. Thanks for coming.
Just one announcement from the Writing Center, just because I'm kind of do it while I can. The writing contest, I sent you all an email about this. Please, please, please encourage your students to submit. As I said in that email, it can make a whole difference to a student if you go to them and say, I think this thing that you wrote is awesome and you should submit it. We want to see a lot of participation in this. There's going to be like an event where we recognize the winners. They get, prizes and things like that. So please, just please tell your students to submit. Email me if you're not sure how to do that, but all that information is on our website and in the email that I sent you. So thank you all so much.
And the deadline for that is a week from today.
Yes.
I had a writing teacher nominate me for an award when I was bouncing around undergrad. That's what got me to be a writing major, got me through to where I am now, for better or worse.
Exactly the same story.
Yep. For me to have masters of that, because master students are supposed to be them too. I will.
Yeah.
Very sorry.
Yeah, I think that's one of my best ideas that have come up with so far in terms of Friday.
Didn't even realize putting her right now.
Ross Cousins is a really good teacher. He's always like, she's got great ideas.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Send me an email. We can figure it out.
Thank you.
Usually,
I'm not sure if
it
you
was
saw the email.
Tuesday,
Wednesday,
So. Me, Wednesday afternoon.
There was that,
Or,
but I also,
yeah.
I had.
Friday. Sort of in the middle of the week, so, send me an email.
Yeah.
No,
Directors. Like that. That's okay.
Okay, I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Feel better?
Yeah. Yes, I think that can happen. I think my first initial thought is that we have these grad student hours that are are sparsely populated, and so we can open that up in that way and make an exception. So the only thing, the question that I would have is, in what way would we, or do we even want to track to see if those students are the students that are like, whether they be coming to those specialized hours or just regular hours that we have. Like, how can we, how do you want to track that? No, go for it, please.
So I think because on the side of the professor, we've given a list of the specific students who are part of the success program, and I told them that they need to forward the writing that they're reporting to us.
Okay,
So all of the tracking will wind up on the professor's side.
okay,
We just need from your side more accessibility time where those students, we can tell them like, if you go during this time slot, there will be time.
okay,
And so that we can help them, because so many of them, like, they're having technology and attendance problems, which some of that is, they're not wanting to show up, but some of that is they have like legitimate negative circumstances where we can tell them, if you have free time, I will help you get to the appointment, but you have to come.
It's also setting some priority. You don't want them to be like, oh, couldn't find an appointment. It's like, I got these times, you can make them.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking between that, I'll have to double check to see how we're doing at SSB, but I could block off the SSB times as well, just for that purpose, just take them off the schedule and or like shift some of those things. So I can make some blocks of time available without a problem.
Yeah.
And what I would want to know, yeah, what I would want to know on my end is just in total. I would just be curious from my end, just like the usage numbers that come out of that. I don't need to know names or specifics, but at the end, if I could just get a total of like, 50 students report to making appointments, or there were 50 appointments made, as a result of this, that would be helpful for me.
I would definitely-
Just to show what we did. Just how the students is happy about it. Much in the spring, not gonna be that in the fall.
Yeah.
I would say for numbers, because this is so last minute, that if we were to establish a program like this, like, in more in advance in the future, we'll probably see better numbers. I think this will be the labeling case. But like, I can tell you, I did the analysis of my student grade this week, and right now, unless they like shape up and get the work in and do this program, I'll be failing at least 15 students between two classes. And I've been doing everything else.
And you're talking about all three, we're only supposed to limit students with a 2.5 average. All three are still students.
Yeah.
Which for Illinois could just be a class of
Right.
Tell us this, we can prep for it, so it's.
Yeah.
It might legitimately be that you got 50 students who just.
Right.
That's